Good day. Before I start with this program, may I say that I, and indeed the Duran, have been in receipt of all sorts of New Year greetings and kind words, and in some cases electronically dispatched New Year and Christmas cards. And I just wanted to make clear that we are grateful for all of these. There are so many of them that we are unable if we're to continue our work to respond to each and every one that has been provided, but all of them are noted, all of them are gratefully received, and thank you, all of those who sent them, and thank you again, and have a very happy new year, and a very prosperous 2023. Now, let's get back to the events of today, and of yesterday, and of course the big events, again, remain in Ukraine. It being a period still just after the New Year holidays, most of the world is getting back to business. And of course, in the United States, we're going to see the new Congress convening shortly with an interesting drama or intrigue about whether Kevin McCarthy will be elected House Speaker. But it's important to remember that in Russia, this is still very much a holiday season, with Christmas celebrated in Russia on the 7th of January, which is Saturday. So with that point made, bear in mind that that does affect the amount of information that we're getting from what still remains, as of the time of the making of this video, by far the most important international story, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, yesterday I discussed at some length, but in a rather speculative way, the results of a Ukrainian missile attack on the town of Makeyevka. This is a town east of Donetsk city. It's a big town. It's about 300,000 people before the war, and it's very much part of the larger Donetsk conurbation, and as I said, it's to the east of Donetsk city, and the Ukrainians launched an attack, and the Russians say it was with 6 HIMARS missiles. 2 of them were shot down, 4 of them hit a vocational school building, which, as the Russians have now confirmed, was being used as a kind of barracks or temporary holding area for some Russian troops. It's not still clear quite how many, but yesterday the Russian authorities confirmed that 63 of their soldiers were killed in this missile attack. Now, I want to make it clear this is not the last, this is not the definitive number. There's still apparently, as of the present time, clearing and rescue work being carried out in this building, and there is some suggestions that the total number of people who were killed is closer to 100, and that there were, of course, other people who were badly wounded or perhaps less badly wounded in this attack. So that, I would suggest, first of all, brings the total number of casualties closer to the 80 to 100 speculated yesterday by Slavyangrad. Riba, another Russian telegram channel, put it higher at about 110. These seem to me to be far more convincing figures than the 400 killed and 700 wounded, which continue to be claimed by Ukraine, with many Western publications, including, by the way, Zero Hedge, as far as I can see, reproducing these Ukrainian claims with little skepticism. It seems to me that the size of the building, of which we have an approximate sense, is makes it most unlikely that there were over 1,000 men there. And these Russian figures seem to me to be reliable and plausible. And by the way, and for the record, when the Russians have previously reported casualties, especially from specific incidents, I've tended to find their claims about, or rather admissions about these casualties to be accurate. Now, what more can one say about this affair? Firstly, how did it come about? Now, there is said to be an investigation by the Russians underway. There are reports, unconfirmed, that President Putin himself has intervened and instructed the Investigative Commission, which is a Russian police agency, it's a civilian police agency, to carry out an investigation of this incident. Now, that suggests that there is some criminal negligence dimension to this affair, and there have been some rumors circulating that somebody, either in the building or nearby, used a mobile phone, and this was picked up by either Ukrainian intelligence or possibly by NATO intelligence, and was what led to this missile strike. In other words, there was misuse by someone of a mobile phone. Now, Russian soldiers are under strict instructions not to carry mobile phones, precisely to avoid eventualities like this. Now, that's at the current moment, only speculation, or rather, I perhaps should say more correctly, it's only rumor. It may be that something else entirely different happened. But if somebody did use a mobile phone, then that might justify or explain why the investigative committee is now looking into this incident, because that would certainly be a breach of regulations, and it might in fact be a criminal matter. Though if a soldier used a mobile phone, then one would have thought that it would be a matter for the military investigating authorities and for court-martial action, rather than civilian investigative authorities like the investigative committee to become involved. But then, of course, it may be that there is a joint investigation of some kind underway. Now, I would say that what does make the mobile phone theory slightly plausible is that it seems that this attack happened late on New Year's Eve, and it's just conceivable, perhaps, that somebody picked up a phone to give some New Year's greeting and gave away more information than they should have done, and that this, as I said, was picked up either by the Ukrainians or by their Western sponsors, and it was what led to this particular attack. Now, I want to stress again, there may be other things we don't know for a fact. For example, I've not seen any official announcement that the investigative committee is involved, though it's been widely reported in Russia. I don't know of any other theories, but of course there might be theories. It could be, for example, that this deployment was picked up by US reconnaissance mechanisms, of which we know that they're very much operating in Ukraine and providing information to the Ukrainian authorities. Or it could be, and this might be another reason why the investigative committee has been called in, it could be that this is a case of espionage, that a Ukrainian agent in Makeyevka and perhaps in Donetsk gained information that this unit of Russian troops, apparently a company-sized deployment, had taken place, and passed that information on to Ukraine. The Russians, by the way, say that this was only a temporary deployment, and it seems likely that these reservists, because it seems that they were people who'd fairly recently been called up and deployed to the area, that these troops were only passing through this building, which suggests, as I said, some kind of security failure, with the Ukrainians picking up on this deployment very quickly and acting upon it with their HIMARS system. So that's all I think we can say about this incident up to now. But what are its bigger implications? And I'm going to make a suggestion, which is that there are no real implications from this thing. Sometimes this tragedy, sometimes in a war, things like this happen. That is the nature of war. There's a security lapse and people die. Sometimes there's a lucky strike and people also die. Sometimes there's an error made and again people die. I'm afraid that is the nature and tragedy of war. And I don't think this is going to make any difference either to the way in which the war is being conducted on the Russian side or to the eventual outcome of this war. Now, as many people are pointing out, this is a Ukrainian strike against which has killed a large number of Russian troops. Russia claims that it launches similar strikes against Ukraine pretty much every day. And the Russian Ministry of Defense reels out every day claims about the number of Ukrainian soldiers who it claims have been killed in these strikes. And in fact, there was a very big strike of precisely that nature on a Ukrainian-controlled town in Donbass yesterday, which the Russians say caused heavy losses amongst Ukrainian troops, though the Ukrainians, for their part, say that only 2 people there were wounded. I'm not obviously present there, so I'm not going to try and guess who's telling the truth on this. Now, of course, it's possible to argue that many of these Russian claims of missile strikes, successful missile strikes against Ukrainian formations, are exaggerated or wrong or straightforwardly false. But those who have observed the war closely, I think, have gradually come to the view that mostly Russian information about these strikes is accurate, and that most of the casualties, the claimed casualties that the Russians are inflicting as a result of these strikes, that they're reasonably accurate as well. Not wholly accurate, but reasonably accurate. So one Ukrainian missile strike, which has killed perhaps 100 Russian soldiers, set against Russian missile strikes, which regularly kill almost every day similar numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. And in fact, I read a report yesterday that from an official of the Donetsk Republic who said that the Ukrainians are losing around 300 soldiers killed every day in the fighting in Donbass, and I don't think he was including those who were killed in missile strikes. By the way, if you want an accurate and detailed breakdown of these missile strikes, the ones that the Russians launched, the Military Summary Channel is the best place to go. Dima, who runs that, keeps an extraordinarily careful eye on all of these missile strikes that the Russians launch pretty much every day. And they do give one a fairly detailed picture. He does give the Military Summary Channel does give a fairly detailed picture of these missile strikes. And as it has pointed out several times, Ukrainian formations, units that have been particularly heavily targeted by these types of Russian missile strikes or precision strikes or artillery strikes or whatever they are, on several occasions have had to be pulled back from the front line and reconstituted with fresh troops because they've suffered such severe losses. So this is war. It is in the nature of war that this sort of thing happens. The one thing about this incident in Makeyevka, which is rather unusual, is that the Russians have provided so much information about it. And I'm going to say that this is different from what used to happen earlier in the war. Some of you may remember, for example, that way back, I think in May, there was an attempt by the Russians to force a river crossing over the Seversky Donetsk River. This was in connection with the fighting that was going on in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The Ukrainian artillery, I think in Lysychansk, caught these Russian troops that were trying to cross the Seversky Donetsk River in the open. The Russians suffered a heavy artillery strike, and there were all sorts of claims afterwards by Ukraine that up to 600 Russian soldiers had been killed in that artillery strike, and there was lots of discussion and excited commentaries about this in the Western media. And the Russians on that occasion said nothing at all about that particular artillery strike, even though satellite and drone pictures, particularly drone pictures, circulated. And this was certainly a bad policy. It allowed the Ukrainian claims to gain traction, even though, as people who had some kind of understanding of these things were able to point out that this was simply not plausible on the facts of this particular artillery strike. The numbers the Ukrainians were claiming were obviously greatly excessive, but one way or the other, the Russians didn't refute those claims, and as I said, they gained traction. Today, the Russians seem to understand that you can't do this. You have to be open when incidents like this take place. You have to correct the false information that is being circulated, or the wrong information that was circulated. You have to provide your own account of what is taking place. They did that with the claims about large casualties in the fighting in Pavlovka near Vuhledar, and they've done this again this time. That's why we know so much about this incident, whereas of course the Ukrainians for the moment are much more secretive about their losses, and that creates more speculation about how extensive or heavy those losses actually are. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this incident. It's gained a lot of publicity. It is a major tragedy. It is not going to affect the outcome of the war. It is a tragedy for the men who were killed. It is a tragedy for the men who were wounded. It is a tragedy for the families of all of these people who have lost their loved ones. It is nonetheless war. Now, what else is happening on the battlefields? Well, there's been more reports of more Russian drone and missile strikes, a lot of heavy Russian strikes apparently behind the Ukrainian front lines, immediately behind the Ukrainian front lines, the Russians targeting the Ukrainian troops that are trying to reinforce positions in Bakhmut and elsewhere. And the Russian authorities claim that they've captured more high ground near Donetsk city. Again, I'm not going to discuss this in detail. What I would simply say is lots of reports of more fighting, perhaps no great breakthrough, but it is undoubtedly the case that the Russians are for the moment very much holding the initiative and are gradually, incrementally pushing forward, and that on an everyday basis in terms of the fighting, it is Ukraine that's suffering more losses. There's also been other reports on the Russians, again, interesting reports. Apparently they've now received a new delivery of large numbers of small reconnaissance drones. Well, lots of talk about that sort of thing. I'm not going to devote more time to that. What I'm going to single and focus on today is a particular passage in Sergei Lavrov's interview with the Great Game program on Channel 1, which I discussed at length yesterday, but I didn't talk about this particular question. and Lavrov's very interesting response to it. And that is going to lead me to a discussion of a question that was asked by Brian Beletic in a recent video that he did on the new Atlas about the possible purpose of this great Polish mobilization. Let me first read the question that was put to Lavrov by the interviewers from this program, The Great Game, and Lavrov's incredibly evasive reply. The question was this: continuing the theme of real threats to strategic stability, Joe Biden said Ukraine must win on the battlefield to prevent a third world war. By the way, in parenthesis, I don't actually recall Joe Biden saying anything of the sort, but then again, perhaps he did, perhaps he didn't. I'm not exactly sure. To continue, what do you think the US will do when Ukraine loses on the battlefield? This seems inevitable to me. They have convinced themselves that this war is not only and not so much for Ukraine, but for American leadership, for the notorious rules-based international order, that is for American hegemony. What will they do when Ukraine loses? Now that is one hell of a question. It's a very, very interesting, very important question. And this is how Lavrov responded. Your question has cornered me. I usually try to think before I say something. Even so, I let things slip sometimes, I confess. When a person says things, they probably have something up their sleeve, if they really mean what they say, that is. And then he goes on into a long, completely irrelevant discussion about negotiations and things of that kind, and Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy and things of this kind. In other words, he dithers and obfuscates, but he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer the question about what the West, what the United States specifically will do if it looks like Ukraine is going to lose the war, as the person who was questioning Lavrov on behalf of the Great Game was basically saying. Well, what is the United States going to do? Well, the short answer is I don't know. But this, as I said, brings me back to Brian Beletic's point, because Brian Beletic has discussed this big Polish mobilization that I have discussed in recent programs, and which we also discussed extensively, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran. And Brian Beletic has suggested that one possible purpose of this mobilization is that if it does look as if Ukraine, its army, is about to collapse, Ukrainian resistance is about to fail, well, the United States cannot accept defeat in the war in Ukraine. So the purpose then of the Polish mobilization would be to send the Polish troops into Ukraine to fight the Russians. And that would obviously mean waiving Article 5, because Poland would not be fighting in defense of its own territory, but it would be fighting the Russians on behalf of the United States in Ukraine. And Brian, of course, referred to Colonel Macgregor's points about the fact that Colonel Macgregor has talked about a coalition of the willing, Poland, Romania and Moldova, each and all three of them engaging in some kind of military campaign in Ukraine, when it becomes clear that the Ukrainians are going to lose the war. Is this going to happen? Is this a plausible possibility? Well, I have to say straight away that I think it is. I think that there is a real possibility, a real danger, that there are some people in Washington who do generally think in this kind of way. And I've said very often that one of the features of the neocons, who are very much, and it must be stressed, the decision makers in Washington at this time, is that collectively and individually they have no reverse gear. And they never learn from their mistakes, and they never revise their policies based upon failures that have happened before. On the contrary, their instinct in any situation that is going wrong is to double down. And we had a vivid illustration of this, a beautiful illustration of this, if I may say, on Brian Beletic's very latest video. He provides a clip from Fox News of an interview with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Now, some of you may remember Oliver North. He was a senior official in the National Security Council in Ronald Reagan's administration. His escapades with Iran and the Contras landed Reagan in a very embarrassing scandal, and North himself was, for a long time, a discredited figure. But as is always the case with neocon-inclined people, that hasn't prevented him bouncing back and being accepted in certain circles as a authority on foreign policy matters. Anyway, Oliver North, says that the United States should continue to support Ukraine, provide Ukraine with every conceivable weapon that it wants and desires. And he says that this is the kind of thing that Ronald Reagan did back in the 1980s. And Oliver North then gives a list of places where the United States in the 1980s, when he was working on the National Security Council, was providing armed assistance to freedom fighters, people that Oliver North, in that interview on Fox News, called freedom fighters. And he mentioned Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, about which I confess I know very little, but he did mention 3 other places. He mentioned Angola, Central America, Nicaragua in effect, and Afghanistan. Now, he also, as I said, used the expression freedom fighters to describe the people who were fighting against Soviet-backed governments in these places. Now, I remember all those wars very well, and I have to say that I personally would struggle to refer to the UNITA movement in Angola, led by Jonas Savimbi, or the Contras in Nicaragua, and certain people who were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. I'm going to be careful what I say because, well, there are sensitivities on the part of a particular platform if I identify certain groups too precisely. But anyway, certain groups in Afghanistan, I personally would have serious difficulty, as I think many people would, describing these people as freedom fighters. But bear in mind what happened in all 3 of these wars. If we're talking about Angola, Jonas Savimbi and his UNITA movement were defeated. The MPLA government, backed by the Soviet Union, which they fought, is still in power. The MPLA government comes in for much criticism from the human rights community in the West. Perhaps some of that criticism is deserved, I don't know. It has eschewed Marxism, and it has pursued carefully balanced foreign policies, but it remains very friendly to China and Russia, And I've heard from people who know the country that it's one of those places where the elite prefers to send its children to China and Russia to study in Chinese and Russian universities in preference to those in the United States and the West. So Angola, certainly not a success. Nicaragua, well, you would have thought that Oliver North, of all people, given his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, would not want to remind anybody about what happened in Nicaragua. But anyway, suffice to say that the current government in Nicaragua is a Sandinista government, the very same government that Ronald Reagan opposed back in the 1980s. It did lose power after the war, but eventually, following various elections, it was returned to power. It's now firmly in control of Nicaragua again, and surprise, surprise, it is strongly aligned with China and Russia. And about Afghanistan, well, I would have thought that no US official, retired or active, would want to talk about Afghanistan today, given the comprehensive debacle that the United States has experienced in everything relating to Afghanistan over the last 30 plus years, which of course extends to certain things that have happened in the United States itself and to a military defeat that the United States suffered there over the course of 2021. I am again careful about what I say. But here we see Oliver North near-con to his fingertips, as he still is. And of course, as far as he's concerned, these abject failures, these ghastly debacles, were a success. The people that were being supported in the 1980s were freedom fighters. And that's the pattern of neocon thinking. You just move forward from one debacle to the next, and if you're ever asked about what happened in the past, Orwellian fashion, you rewrite it. You make failure appear like a success, even as you advocate more of the same today. So, and you're able to do that, by the way, because that's happened in that Fox News interview. Oliver North, of course, is not challenged about his own peculiar memory of the history of all of these wars back in the 1980s. But there we go. So that's the neocon mindset. They are not, at any point in time, going to admit error. They're not even really going to admit failure. When failure does take place, their policy is always to blame someone else. They say that if their advice had been followed, if things had been done in an even more extreme and confrontational and belligerent way, success would have followed. There's been an extraordinary, very bizarre article in the New York Times, for example, which questions whether the Russians even have red lines and suggests that, we can disregard Russian red lines, we can go to the full, most extreme action because, well, the Russians don't have red lines, and what they think and what they might do really doesn't matter. So if it fails, it's because people didn't take the most extreme position, did the most extreme steps that the neocons themselves recommended. And in light of this, what they always say is double down. If things don't seem to be going right, send more troops, send more weapons, get your allies to intervene, the US's allies to intervene. So I think it's highly likely, in fact I think it's an absolute certainty, that once it becomes clear that Ukraine is definitely losing the war, you will see the neocons in the United States, in Washington, in London as well, where they are perhaps even more powerful than they are in Washington, in Brussels too. they will come together and they will demand some form of escalation. And it is not impossible that they will demand or that they will support any move by Poland to enter Ukraine and to take on the Russians there. Now, having said that, it's important to say that this can only happen if the Polish government itself decides to take that kind of fatal step. And would they do it? Well, I'm going to say straight away that I don't think the Polish government will simply do the bidding of the neocons. It's not just going to go into Ukraine to pull the neocons' coals out of the fire. It's going to go into Ukraine because it has its own particular agenda. And there's a number of things to be said about this. Firstly, is this Polish mobilization really intended to take the Russians on in a war in Ukraine? Is Poland, in other words, preparing to fight Russia over Ukraine? Well, it seems to me that there are three possible explanations for this Polish build-up. And I should say that I've heard from people in Romania that they have no information or reason to believe that any comparable build-up is taking place there. And I don't think Moldova is in any position to intervene in any war. Most of the population in Moldova would strongly oppose it. And I think any attempt by the current Moldovan government to intervene against Russia would probably lead to the collapse of that government. So it is only Poland that we are talking about. So it seems to me that there are three possible explanations for this Polish mobilization. The first one is that it is entirely defensive. And I had, as I think I've discussed in a recent video, a very, very interesting and authoritative email from a correspondent. Again, I'm not going to reveal anything about this person's identity, but this person who has a military background, a senior military background, pointed out that one reason why Poland might be engaging in a build-up is in order to beef up its defences. It might not be expecting a Russian attack on Poland, which nobody, I think, truly imagines. But in a situation where there's a Ukrainian military collapse, there could be all kinds of problems on the Polish border. There could be, for example, cases of Ukrainian units fleeing across the border or trying to flee across the border into Poland with conceivably the Russians hot on their heels. Now, we're not in that situation, yet we may never come to it. But it's not impossible to imagine such a scenario. And if we get into that kind of situation, well, you would want large numbers of Polish troops there to secure the border. So that might be the reason, and it's a good reason, it's a plausible reason why the Poles might be engaging in a build-up now. And since you need trained troops, and since the Polish army, the serving army, is not especially large, calling up reservists now in order to do that might be a good idea. Now, the second possibility is that the Poles are not really interested in Ukraine at all, that they're instead out to reoccupy territories that they consider part of their historic Polish homeland. Western Ukraine, Galicia, the town of Lvov, the city of Lvov, for example. And I've discussed in recent programs how I think that would be a dangerous trap for the Ukrainians, for the Poles to fall into. But I can certainly believe that there are some people in Poland, especially in the current Polish government, who might be prepared to go down that route. And I've also said in recent programs that Vladimir Putin himself has recently given signals that whilst the Russians would not welcome a Polish advance into Western Ukraine, Russia itself has no interest in Western Ukraine, or has lost interest in Western Ukraine. It now considers this territory irreconcilably anti-Russian. And if the Poles want it, well, they're welcome to it. So that's one second possibility. There is a third one, and that is the one that Brian Beletic is saying, that this is all part of some plan to send the Polish army to fight the Russians and to enact the strategies of the neocons. And I'm sorry to say, I fear that there are some people in the Polish political leadership who might be prepared to go down that route. They have such a visceral antipathy and fear of Russia, one which has historical foundations, it must be said, that they might even take the utterly reckless step of sending the regular Polish army into Ukraine, as opposed to volunteer units, which have been active in Ukraine for some time. Anyway, the regular Polish army to fight the Russians there as part of the coalition of the willing that Colonel McGregor is talking about. So I can't discount that possibility. But if it were to happen, well, I think that we would be in a crisis, the like of which we have never seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And I'd like to highlight here some words that President Biden himself used over the course of President Zelensky's visit to Washington, when Biden met with Zelensky. He was asked certain questions by the media, and Biden said that the United States was absolutely not going to get itself involved in a war with the Russians. He said that there'd been lots of discussion and talk with European leaders. He didn't say which European leaders, but he said that these European leaders had made it very clear to him, to Biden, that they were prepared to go along with a lot of these anti-Russian policies. There was one place that they would not go to, and that is any kind of situation where there would be a war with Russia. They were not prepared to fight Russia. And Biden, making clear that these are sensitive discussions with top leaders, top European leaders, then even went further and said that he was perhaps saying more than he should. Quite an interesting comment, by the way. So Biden has signaled that the leaders of certain European countries, Germany, France, probably, conceivably also the Sunak government in Britain, though I would be less certain of that, to be frank, but other European governments, no doubt, but certainly Germany and France, have made it absolutely clear that they will not agree to any situation in which Europe, NATO, the United States finds itself in a war with Russia. They do not want to fight Russia. And I'm going to say straight away that I think that this is also the overwhelming view of the public in these countries. Now, in both Germany and France, up to now, the official narrative about this war in Ukraine, that it is an act of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, has tended to hold. Most people in Germany accept it. A lot of people in France do, that their opinion is much more balanced. But if Poland, the Polish army, goes into Ukraine and fights the Russians there, I expect that to change, and change immediately. The German public might accept economic sacrifices on behalf of a Ukraine that is the victim of Russian aggression. They might, though they're becoming increasingly less keen on this, agree to the supply of German weapons to Ukraine in order, as they would see it, for Ukraine to defend itself. They would not, of this I am absolutely sure, support Poland and the United States in another in the long series of Polish-Russian wars. I think it is inconceivable that would happen. I think it is inconceivable that would happen in France. I'm sure that would be the case in many other European countries as well. So, if the Polish army marches into Ukraine in order to fight the Russians, I think there would be a massive split in NATO. I think it would be impossible at that point to paper that split over. And I'm going to say something else. I think were that to happen, then perceptions about the war in Europe would change. I think this orthodoxy about the war that we've seen imposed and which the European public has up to now, in general, though rather grudgingly accepted, that it's all the fault of the Russians, well, that would change radically if it looked to the European public that this is all about a war between Poland and Russia, with the United States somehow operating in the background, egging Poland along. And I think that we could, at that point, see fissures and a breakdown in NATO, the like of which we have never seen before. I think Biden has been told that unequivocally by the European leadership. That's essentially what he admitted when Zelensky came to Washington. And I think that though there are clearly divisions in Washington, though I think the neocons, as I said, would be fully on board with any intervention by Poland in Ukraine in the kind of way that Douglas McGregor and Brian Belletic have speculated. I think that such an attempt by Poland to intervene in Ukraine would be a disaster. It would be a geopolitical disaster. It would have a horrific blowback for the United States and for NATO itself. I'm not going to even start on the other question, which is what people in Poland itself would think about this. I strongly suspect that there would be massive divisions and disagreements about it in Poland too. But that is another topic which perhaps some of our Polish correspondents with whom we work and whom we interview on the Duran might have things to say. So, overall, I think that in this finely balanced argument that we see in Washington, I think that we will not go there. I personally do not believe that the Poles will enter Ukraine in order to fight the Russians, because I think long before we get to that point, the Europeans, the more realist people in the United States at that point would draw back. That is my view. Now, again, let me stress, neocons are a strange group of people. You've seen my analysis, you've heard my analysis about Oliver North's really bizarre and extraordinary interview. It could very well be that that the neocons will just go for broke, and that they will prevail over the administration, and they will give the green light. And as I said, we will see the Polish army sent into Ukraine to fight the Russian army, at which point all the catastrophic consequences that I've just outlined, I suspect, will unveil. But for the moment, I suspect that, as I said, the line would hold. Now, there is another fact which points again to the fact that we have a push-pull situation within Washington. Remember my discussion of Lavrov's interview yesterday. He said that the Russians have been getting conflicting signals from the Americans, that the meeting between Burns and Narishkin in Ankara was in effect sabotaged by someone when the fact of it was leaked to the media, so that meeting wasn't able to progress in the way that was intended. He also said, Lavrov also said, that there'd been some suggestions from the Americans that there'd be further high-level meetings, but these never materialized because the Americans weren't able to get their act together. So that suggests, as I said, conflict in Washington. But we had another piece of information which suggests to me the same thing. And this is about this Patriot missile delivery to Ukraine. Now, there's been speculation that this Patriot missile system would find its way to Ukraine in the early first half of 2023. There's now an article appearing, and it looks like a well-sourced article in the US media, which suggests that the Patriot missile will only find its way to Ukraine in about a year's time, in 2024. That the time to train Ukrainian operators of this system will take at least a year. And as Lavrov said, the United States has given absolute assurances to the Russians that the United States, US personnel, contract personnel or whatever, would not be involved in operating this Patriot missile system. Moreover, it seems definite now that there will be only one delivery of this Patriot missile system, or at least that's the word that's going out. There won't be others, and apparently it will not be the more mobile version of the Patriot. It will be one that is a sort of fixed location and therefore very vulnerable. And overall, and by and large, it looks increasingly as if this delivery, this Patriot delivery, or rather this Patriot sale, is not a real sale of an operating system at all. It is rather either a symbolic move by the United States, what Colonel McGregor calls a parting gift by the United States to Ukraine, or perhaps it's a compromise move following the arguments and quarrels that look like they're taking place in Washington. The hardliners wanted weapons deliveries, more advanced weapons deliveries to Ukraine. They demanded the delivery of Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. The realists in the Pentagon were able to limit that to one battery, which would not be delivered before 2024 and which would not be manned by US personnel. So, for the moment, this is a balanced argument that's going on in the United States, or so it seems to me. And I think overall, and by and large, the US will not give the green light for the Poles to go into Ukraine, or at least encourage the Poles to go into Ukraine to fight the Russians in order to stop the Russians defeating the Ukrainians, as apparently many people believe will happen. But let me say again, I don't think this is a definite thing. The neocons have tended to win their political battles in Washington. It is not impossible that they will achieve their objective again. And let's go back to that extraordinary question and reply in that interview to Lavrov. Question again, What do you think the US will do when Ukraine loses on the battlefield? They have convinced themselves that this war is not only and not so much for Ukraine, but for American leadership, for the notorious rules-based international order that is for American hegemony. What will they do when Ukraine loses? And Lavrov, your question has cornered me. I usually try to think before I say something. Even so, I let things slip sometimes, I confess. When a person says such things, they probably have something up their sleeve, if they really mean what they say, that is. In other words, the Russians, this is my conclusion from Lavrov's words, the Russians are aware, are considering the possibility that there will be some sort of direct NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine. But Lavrov doesn't want to talk about this in an interview. That's the only explanation I can give for the evasive way in which he answers this question. He doesn't want to escalate tensions, to inflame fears by talking about the possibility of NATO intervention. And when we're talking about NATO intervention, direct NATO intervention, troops going in to fight the Russians in Ukraine, well, that can only mean the Poles. So this is a possibility that the Russians are definitely aware of and which they are considering. Now, we shall see what happens. I think, as I said, that the line will hold. I think that the realists will prevail. I think Biden has been put on notice, even by the weak and abject European leaders, by Scholz, Macron, and the rest, that this is something that if it happens, a military intervention to fight the Russians in Ukraine, that the European public will break, that they will not support it. I don't think they will support it, by the way, in Poland. I'm sure they will not support it in the United States. So I think that the realists will hold, but will be able to hold the line. But I'm not sure. Lavrov's evasive answer shows that the Russians are not sure either. It's something that only time can give the answer to. And of course, we have to see over time what that answer is. Of one thing I am certain, as I said, if NATO in some form, or a NATO member state like Poland, does intervene in Ukraine in the way that Colonel Macgregor says, that will probably, in fact almost certainly, be the end of NATO. I think there are people in Washington who understand it, and just to finish, I think that is why it won't happen. Anyway, that's me for the day. An article, rather a video discussing, as I said, a topic which, we've got to wait and see how it works out. I'll be very interested to see what other people think about this. It's a complex, intricate subject, worrying one in many respects, shows how high the stakes in this war have become, and we'll see what happens. More from me soon. I'll be back to perhaps the more usual things, discussing what's happening on the battlefields, the missile strikes and those sort of things. Lots going on around the world. But as I said, this is an important question. What the Poles, what NATO, what the United States, what the neocons might do. And I think it's not too soon to ask it and to see how things play out, to discuss how things might play out. Well, thank you again for joining me today. Let me remind you again that you can find these programs on multiple platforms, including Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop and see the amazing things that you can find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and other great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.